The summer sun had never been so merciless over the small frontier town of Dry Creek. Day after day, the land lay cracked and broken, the earth thirsty for rain that never came. Once green fields had withered to brittle stalks, and the air carried the scent of dust more than the scent of life. Cattle lay thin and restless near the wooden fences, their ribs showing, their calls weaker than they should have been. Famine had crept into Dry Creek slowly, like a shadow stretching across the land. At first, folks tightened their belts, telling themselves it was just another dry season that would pass. But weeks turned into months, and the wagons that once brought flour, beans, and salted meat arrived less and less. Prices for food soared, and soon only the wealthiest could afford even the smallest morsel. The townsfolk had begun to barter whatever they could spare: handmade quilts, worn boots, tools, jewelry, anything that might earn them a bit of bread or a handful of grain. Some sold their livestock, others abandoned their homes in search of better lands. Still, most stayed, clinging stubbornly to the soil they'd built their lives upon, even if it offered nothing in return. The heart of the town, once lively with laughter and chatter, had grown eerily quiet. The saloon's piano was silent. The church bell rang less often. And the marketplace, once filled with traders calling out their goods, had dwindled to a somber gathering of desperate souls, each hoping today might bring a chance at survival. At the center of this hardship stood the rancher's wagon. It was one of the few places in town where food could still be found, though at a steep cost. The old rancher, a stern man hardened by years of toil, rationed out supplies only to those who could offer something valuable in exchange. For him, survival meant fairness, and fairness meant no handouts. Gold, silver, or strong livestock, that was the only currency worth his grain. Around this wagon, faces gathered daily, hollow-eyed and gaunt. Mothers clutched children to their skirts, trying to shield them from the sight of hunger gnawing at their neighbors. Old men sat quietly in the shade, their eyes dull, waiting for some miracle that never seemed to come. It was in this bleak setting that whispers of kindness or cruelty spread faster than the wind. When a man traded his prized rifle for a sack of beans, folks shook their heads in pity. When a mother sold her wedding brooch for a loaf of bread, neighbors muttered about sacrifice and survival. But most stories ended the same way: possessions gone, stomachs still half empty, and hope shrinking smaller by the day. For the poorest in Dry Creek, those with nothing left to trade, life had become unbearable. Some turned to begging. Others scavenged through the dust, praying for something edible. A few disappeared altogether, swallowed by the cruel hand of starvation. The town itself wore the look of despair. Windows remained shuttered, doors barred, and the streets echoed with fewer footsteps than ever before. At night, the silence was heavy, broken only by the restless cry of coyotes in the distance. And yet even in the midst of such despair, there lingered a quiet strength among some of the townsfolk. Though hunger carved into their bones, they carried on, sharing small scraps, helping neighbors when possible, and whispering prayers for rain. They had endured storms before, but this trial was unlike any they had faced. It was against this backdrop of dust, hunger, and fading hope that her story began. The story of a woman who held on to one last treasure, a simple gold ring, believing it could save her and the brother who depended on her. She did not yet know that the ring, though precious, would pale in comparison to what fate had in store for her. Her name was Clara. Not long ago, she had been known in Dry Creek as the woman with the warm smile and the steady hands who stitched torn clothes and baked bread that smelled of home. But those days had vanished with the rains, leaving only shadows behind. Clara had been widowed young. Her husband, Daniel, a kind man who once worked the ranch fields, had died in an accident nearly 2 years before the drought began. She had mourned deeply but kept going, not for herself but for the little boy who now clung to her as if she were his whole world. Her younger brother, Samuel. Their parents had been taken by fever, leaving Clara as both sister and mother. Samuel was only 9, his cheeks once round with childhood, now hollowed by hunger. Every morning, Clara woke with a gnawing emptiness in her stomach. She would lie still, listening to Samuel's breathing, praying that he wouldn't wake crying from hunger again. When he did, she forced herself to smile, brushing back his tangled hair and whispering, "We'll find food today, Sammy, I promise." But the promises grew harder to keep. Her home, a small cabin on the edge of town, had once been filled with small comforts, patchwork quilts, jars of preserved fruit, laughter around the table. Now the cupboards were bare, the quilts worn thin, and laughter a distant memory. She had sold nearly everything they owned, her husband's tools, the spare chair, even the kettle, bartered away piece by piece for scraps of bread or a few handfuls of beans. All that remained was a single item she could not bear to part with: Daniel's wedding ring. It rested on her finger, not as jewelry anymore, but as a memory of love and better days. Many nights, when hunger clawed at her insides, she would twist the ring, feeling its familiar weight, drawing strength from it. Selling it felt like letting go of him entirely, as if his presence would vanish with it. But Samuel's frail frame left her with little choice. The boy had grown so thin that his clothes, once snug, now hung loosely from his shoulders. His energy faded, and his laughter, once so easy to spark, had become rare. Clara could not endure watching his life slip away piece by piece. On this day, as the hot wind swept dust into her eyes, Clara looked at Samuel and made her decision. The ring must go. She would take it to the rancher's wagon and trade it for bread, enough to fill her brother's stomach at least for a few days. Perhaps later something better might come. Perhaps the rains would return, or supplies would arrive from the railroads. But today, Samuel needed food, and love alone could not feed him. Clara slipped the ring from her finger and held it in her palm. For a long while, she simply stared at it. The gold had dulled with time, but in the sunlight, it still caught a faint glimmer. She remembered the day Daniel had slid it onto her hand, his smile nervous but his eyes bright. She remembered his vow, whispered softly at the small church, that he would always provide for her. Her throat tightened. "Forgive me, Daniel," she whispered. "I promise to keep it forever, but Samuel needs it more than I do." Samuel tugged at her sleeve. His lips were cracked, his eyes tired. "Clara, will we have bread tonight?" She closed her hand around the ring, pressing it tight against her skin. "Yes, Sammy," she said, forcing her voice steady. "We will." And so, with the weight of hunger and love pressing upon her, Clara took her brother's hand and set out toward the heart of town, toward the rancher's wagon, where her last treasure might buy them another chance at survival. The town square was alive with the low hum of desperation. Dust swirled in the hot wind as men, women, and children gathered around the rancher's wagon, each clutching whatever scraps of value they had left to barter. Horses shifted restlessly nearby, the animals as gaunt and weary as their owners. Clara held Samuel's hand tightly, guiding him through the small crowd. He stumbled once, too weak from hunger, and she bent down quickly, steadying him. His small fingers were cold despite the heat, and that alone made Clara's heart clench harder than any hunger pang could. The wagon loomed before them, sturdy oak boards laden with sacks of flour, bundles of dried beans, and a few loaves of bread carefully wrapped in cloth. To the starving eyes of Dry Creek, it looked like a treasure chest. And guarding it, as always, stood the rancher himself, a tall, broad man with lines etched deep into his face, his eyes sharp and unyielding. The people of Dry Creek had long learned that he dealt only in trade. Gold, silver, livestock, tools, something of equal value for the food he offered. Many resented his hardness, yet they came to him all the same, for survival made even the proudest bend their heads. Clara stepped forward, her stomach twisting with nerves. She could feel the ring burning in her palm as though it knew what she was about to do. Her lips were dry, her voice faint, but she forced herself to speak. "Please," she said, holding out her hand. The ring glinted weakly in the harsh sun. This gold ring, for bread. Just one loaf?" The rancher's eyes narrowed. He reached out, plucking the ring from her hand and holding it up to the light. He turned it slowly between his rough fingers, weighing its worth. For Clara, each second he examined it was a torment. Behind her, Samuel tugged gently at her skirt, his eyes locked on the loaves of bread. Around them, the townsfolk watched. Some murmured softly, most recognized the ring. They remembered when Daniel had placed it on her finger, remembered the happiness that had once shone in her face. Now those same neighbors watched her trade away the last symbol of her love and her old life. The rancher rubbed the ring once more and grunted. "Gold's worth something," he said, his voice slow and gravelly. "But times are hard. A single ring doesn't feed a man long." Clara's heart dropped. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Just one loaf. It's for my brother. He hasn't eaten in 2 days. I'll give you the ring. Everything I have left." The rancher studied her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Clara thought he might refuse, and the thought nearly broke her. What more could she offer? What else could she give when she had nothing but that ring and her own weary body? "Pa!" a new voice interrupted. Clara turned. Standing beside the wagon was the rancher's son, a young man she had seen only in passing. He was tall, broad-shouldered like his father, but his eyes, gentle, steady, and strangely bright, were different. He had been watching her, and in that gaze she felt something she hadn't felt in months, not pity, but compassion. The son stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "That ring," he said softly, "isn't what matters." He glanced at Samuel, then back at Clara. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper meant only for her. "Gold isn't what we need. You are worth more than that." For a moment the crowd fell silent, stunned. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had expected rejection, or at best a hard bargain. But not this. Not words that stripped away her despair and left her trembling with something she hadn't felt in a long while. Hope. The rancher frowned, his hand still holding the ring. But his son's gaze held firm, challenging him in a way that made Clara's heart pound. Something was about to change, though she could not yet see how. The rancher's son stepped down from the wagon, his boots landing firmly on the dry, cracked earth. A hush rippled through the crowd as he closed the distance between himself and Clara. He wasn't often seen at the wagon during trades. Usually, his father conducted business alone. But now his presence seemed to shift the air, drawing every pair of weary eyes toward him. Clara tightened her grip on Samuel's hand. Her brother looked up at her, confused, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Clara, too, was uncertain. She had never spoken more than a polite greeting to the rancher's son before, yet the way he looked at her now unsettled her. His gaze wasn't cold or calculating like his father's. It was steady, searching, as though he were seeing more than just a desperate woman with a ring. "Pa," he said again, his voice calm but carrying a quiet strength. "She's not trading just gold." "Look at her," the rancher grunted, still rolling the ring between his fingers. "Gold is gold. Ain't nothing more to look at. You know the rules. Trade or no trade." But the son shook his head. He glanced at Samuel, whose small frame trembled beside Clara, then back to his father. "Rules don't matter if they starve before the week's end. She doesn't need to give up her ring." His words carried an unusual weight, not a plea, but a conviction. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some nodded in agreement, others frowned, worried that the rancher might punish his son for speaking out. A man like him didn't tolerate being challenged, not even by his own blood. Clara felt her heart racing. This wasn't how she had imagined it. She had expected to beg, to hand over her last treasure and walk away with food, her dignity stripped, but her brother fed. Instead, the young man had turned the moment into something different, something she could not yet define. The rancher's eyes narrowed. "Boy, you think sentiment fills bellies? Gold feeds families. Not words?" The son's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "And yet, Pa, sometimes a person is worth more than what they carry in their pockets. If you can't see that, maybe you've forgotten what Ma used to say, a heart can feed more souls than gold ever could." The old man stiffened at the mention of his late wife, his grip tightening around the ring. The crowd fell silent again, every ear straining. Clara's own breath caught in her chest. She could see the struggle playing across the rancher's weathered face, pride, stubbornness, and something softer buried beneath. Finally, the rancher growled low in his throat. "You've got too much softness in you. World don't work that way." "Maybe it should," the son replied evenly. Then he turned his gaze back to Clara and his voice softened. "Keep your ring. You shouldn't have to give up the last piece of someone you love." The words hit Clara harder than she expected. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, unwilling to let the crowd see her break. Samuel squeezed her hand, looking up at the young man with wide, hopeful eyes. The son stepped closer still, his shadow falling across Clara and her brother. From this distance, she could see the sincerity etched in his expression, the quiet fire in his eyes that his father seemed to lack. He wasn't pitying her. He was recognizing her worth, seeing her not as a beggar, but as a woman who had endured more than most could bear. The rancher's grip on the ring loosened, but he didn't return it yet. The tension hung in the air like a taut rope ready to snap. The people of Dry Creek waited, breathless, to see whether the old man's iron will or his son's compassion would win out. For Clara, the moment stretched on endlessly. Her stomach twisted, her mind raced, and yet deep inside, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months began to stir. Hope. The rancher's hand hovered, the gold ring glinting faintly between his thick fingers. The crowd waited in hushed silence, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting between father and son. This was not how trades went in Dry Creek. The rules had always been simple. You give what's valuable, you get food in return. But now, with the son's words still hanging heavy in the air, something in those rules was beginning to bend. Clara's chest tightened as she clutched Samuel closer. She wanted to speak, to beg once more if she had to, but her voice failed her. She could only watch as her fate and her brother's survival balanced precariously on the edge of this moment. The rancher finally spoke, his voice hard as stone. "You think words can fill a stomach? You think soft feelings can keep a child alive?" He lifted the ring higher, letting the sun catch it for all to see. "This is real. Gold don't rot, don't wither. It buys grain when nothing else will. That's the only truth in times like these." Clara's heart sank. She felt the ache of defeat rise within her, sharper than hunger itself. Perhaps it had been foolish to hope. Perhaps even his son's kindness couldn't break through the iron rules that governed survival. But then, the young man stepped closer. His voice was steady, calm, but filled with a quiet force that silenced the murmurs of the crowd. "No, Pa, you're wrong. Sometimes what's real isn't what you can hold in your hand. Sometimes it's the strength of someone who refuses to give up, even when the world has taken everything from them." His eyes met Clara's, and for the briefest of moments, the world around her seemed to fall away. His gaze wasn't filled with pity, it was filled with recognition, as if he saw in her the same unyielding spirit that lived within himself. The rancher's face darkened, the creases around his mouth deepening. "You're a fool," he growled, thrusting the ring toward his son. "If she won't trade, then she won't eat. That's the way of things. You can't save everyone. The son didn't take the ring." Instead, he pushed it back toward his father, shaking his head. "I don't want the ring, and she doesn't need to give it up." His voice grew firm, carrying across the square. "Because her worth isn't measured in gold. And I'll not stand by and watch you take the last piece of her heart just so she can put crumbs in her belly." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. No one had ever spoken to the rancher that way, not in public, not in defiance of his rules. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled, and she pressed Samuel closer to her side, torn between gratitude and fear. She couldn't imagine the old rancher taking this lightly. Men like him didn't bend. They broke anything that tried to challenge their will. The rancher's eyes blazed with anger, but beneath it lingered something else, a flicker of doubt, perhaps even shame. He looked down at the ring, then back at his son. For the first time, the strength in his grip faltered. "You'll regret this," he muttered. Yet even as he spoke, he slid the ring back into Clara's trembling palm. His hand was rough, reluctant, but the act itself was undeniable, a refusal to take her last treasure. Clara's eyes widened. She hadn't expected this, hadn't dared to imagine it. The ring, cool and familiar, pressed against her skin once more. She clutched it tightly, overwhelmed by relief and confusion all at once. The rancher turned away sharply, his voice gruff as he barked to his son. "If you're so set on wasting food, then it's on your head. Don't come crying to me when the bins run dry." The young man nodded, unflinching. "I'll bear it." Then he turned back to Clara, his expression softer, almost tender. And with that, the unthinkable had happened. She had offered her ring for bread, and it had been refused, not out of cruelty, but out of compassion. The weight of the ring in Clara's palm was almost unbearable. She closed her fingers around it tightly, her breath catching in her throat. Around her, the townsfolk murmured in disbelief. Nobody refused gold, not in Dry Creek, not in a time like this. And yet here she stood, the ring still hers, the bargain unmade. She looked up, uncertain whether to speak, but the rancher's son was already there, standing so close that she could see the faint dust clinging to his shirt, the way the sun caught the bronze in his hair. His eyes, clear, steady, unshaken, were fixed on her. "You don't need to give it away," he said softly, his voice low enough that it was meant for her and not the watching crowd. "That ring, it's not just gold. It's love, it's memory. It's the part of you that still holds on to hope." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes, though she fought them back. No one had spoken to her like this in so long. For months, she had been seen only as another mouth to feed, another desperate soul scraping by. Yet in this moment, he saw her as something more. He glanced at Samuel, whose wide, hungry eyes clung to the loaves of bread stacked neatly behind the wagon. Then he looked back at Clara, his expression gentling even further. "Your worth isn't in gold," he continued. "It's in the way you keep fighting for him when most folks would have given up. It's in the strength it takes to stand here, to offer the last piece of yourself just so he can eat." Clara swallowed hard, her hand trembling as she pulled Samuel closer. She had always carried her struggle in silence, hiding her pain behind a quiet resolve. To hear someone name it aloud, to see her sacrifice recognized, it was almost too much to bear. "You think this ring will feed him?" the young man went on. "But the truth is, what he needs most isn't bread. It's you, your love, your courage. That's what keeps him alive, even more than food." The words sank into her, each one striking deeper than the last. She thought of the nights she'd stayed awake by Samuel's side, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She thought of the way she had sold everything, every scrap, every belonging, just to keep him alive one more day. And now here was someone telling her that her fight mattered, that she mattered. Clara's lips trembled. "But he's starving," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't watch him fade away. I can't lose him." The young man nodded slowly, his gaze never wavering. "And you won't. I promise you that." His voice grew firmer, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "You don't need to trade your memories for survival. Not while I can help." A ripple of astonishment passed through the crowd. Clara felt every eye on her, but she couldn't look away from him. His words were like a hand reaching into the darkness she had been trapped in, pulling her into light. The rancher shifted uneasily, clearly disapproving, but he said nothing. Perhaps even he could not deny the truth of his son's conviction. Samuel tugged at Clara's skirt, whispering, "Clara, what did he mean?" She knelt down, clutching him to her chest, her tears finally spilling. "He means, we're not alone, Sammy, not anymore." The young man's gaze softened further, and though no more words passed between them in that moment, Clara knew something had changed. The trade she had come to make had not been accepted, but instead, she had been given something she hadn't expected at all: dignity, compassion, and a reminder of her own worth. For the first time in many months, Clara allowed herself to believe that survival might mean more than just food in the belly. Perhaps, just perhaps, it could mean hope in the heart as well. The crowd still lingered, restless and whispering. All eyes were fixed on Clara, on the young boy at her side, and on the rancher's son who had just broken his father's unyielding rules. The tension hung thick in the dusty air, heavy as storm clouds that refused to break. Clara held Samuel tightly against her, the ring warm in her clenched fist. The son's words still echoed in her ears, words she hadn't expected, words she didn't know how to carry. But words alone could not fill Samuel's stomach, and the boy's trembling frame reminded her of that cruel truth. The rancher's son turned, stepping back toward the wagon. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, but every person watching could feel the quiet rebellion in them. He reached for a loaf of bread, its crust golden, its smell rich even through the cloth it was wrapped in. Then he picked up a small sack of beans and another of flour, tucking them under his arm. "Pa," he said firmly, glancing at his father, "these are theirs." The rancher's face darkened, thunder gathering in his eyes. "Boy, don't you dare!" But the son cut him off, his voice calm but steady, carrying across the square. "If you won't give it, then I will. And I'll carry the weight of it, same as I carry your name." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Never had anyone defied the rancher so openly, least of all his own son. For a moment, the square felt alive with a strange electricity, as though something long suppressed was breaking loose. Clara stared, stunned, as the young man stepped toward her, holding out the bread and sacks. "Take these," he said gently. "Not as payment, not as charity. Take them because you need them, because he needs them." His eyes softened as they flicked to Samuel. No child should go to bed hungry. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She looked at the food, at the sustenance she had prayed for, and then at the man offering it freely. Her pride, worn thin but still alive, battled with her desperation. To take without giving, it felt wrong, almost shameful. "I can't," she whispered hoarsely, pushing the bread back toward him. "I have nothing left to give you. Nothing but this ring." She held it out again, her hand trembling. The son shook his head firmly, refusing to touch it. "Keep it. It's not yours to give away. It's a memory, a promise. You shouldn't trade the last piece of your heart for a crust of bread." His words cut through her resistance, leaving her weak, unsteady. Samuel's wide eyes were locked on the food, his small hands reaching without hesitation. Clara's heart ached at the sight. His hunger was stronger than her pride. Slowly, she loosened her fingers and allowed Samuel to take the loaf, his little arms wrapping around it as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. Clara's vision blurred with tears. She clutched the ring tightly against her chest, as if holding on to both her past and her future in that single motion. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't know what this means." The son's expression softened. "I think I do," he said quietly. Behind them, the rancher let out a low growl of disapproval, but he didn't stop his son. Perhaps even he knew that in this moment there was no undoing what had been done. The people had seen it. The defiance, the compassion, the breaking of a rule in the name of humanity. The young man glanced once at the crowd, then back at Clara. "Take him home. Feed him. Tomorrow will come, and when it does, you'll still have your ring and your strength." Clara nodded slowly, her tears finally spilling. For the first time in months, Samuel's face lit up with a small smile as he clutched the loaf to his chest. And in that fragile smile, Clara saw more than survival. She saw hope beginning to take root again. The loaf of bread was gone within hours, shared carefully between Clara and Samuel. Every bite felt like a blessing, though Clara saved the largest piece for her brother, watching his cheeks finally flush with some color. The flour and beans stretched further, lasting through the week. For the first time in months, the heaviness in her chest lifted, just slightly. But what stayed with her most wasn't the bread or the beans. It was the young man's words. "Gold isn't what we need. You are worth more than that." They clung to her mind, even in the silence of night, making her wonder if he had seen something in her that she herself had forgotten. The next morning, Clara expected resistance. She thought the rancher's son would be forbidden from helping her again, that his father's anger would close every door. But just as she stepped outside to fetch water, she saw him. He was waiting by the well with 2 pails already drawn, the ropes coiled neatly. "I figured your arms could use a rest," he said with a crooked smile. Clara froze, torn between gratitude and caution. People were watching from doorways, whispering already. The rancher's son offering help to a widow barely surviving, that was fuel for gossip. Still, when he handed her one of the pails, the weight lifted easily in her grasp. She hadn't realized how tired she truly was until that moment. In the days that followed, his quiet kindness became a steady presence. Some mornings, he left bundles of firewood stacked neatly at her door. Other times, she'd find a jar of milk or a small sack of dried fruit set discreetly on the windowsill. He never demanded thanks, never asked for anything in return. At first, Clara tried to refuse. She was determined not to be seen as weak, as someone who lived only on another's mercy. But every time she tried to protest, he met her resistance with gentle insistence. "This isn't charity," he told her once, after she tried to push back a basket of eggs. "It's neighbor helping neighbor. If folks remembered that more often, maybe this town wouldn't be so hollow." Clara lowered her eyes, her throat tightening. She hadn't felt like anyone's neighbor in a long while, more like an outcast, a shadow people overlooked. But somehow his words made her believe she still belonged. Samuel took to him quickly. The boy followed him like a shadow, tugging at his sleeve, asking endless questions about horses, cattle, and the ranch life. The son, whose name Clara finally learned was James, answered each question patiently, even lifting Samuel onto a saddle one afternoon and leading him slowly around the corral. The boy's laughter rang out, bright and free, a sound Clara hadn't heard in far too long. Each act of kindness built something invisible between them, something stronger than the walls of pride Clara had built around herself. She noticed it in the way her heart eased when she saw him approach, in the way Samuel's eyes lit up at his presence. She noticed it, too, in the way James looked at her, not with pity, but with respect, as if he saw a strength she didn't even see in herself. Yet whispers spread. Some in town muttered that Clara was using her looks to lure the rancher's son. Others warned James that helping her would bring nothing but trouble. Clara heard the whispers, felt the sting of them, and sometimes wondered if she should pull away to protect him. But then she'd remember Samuel's laughter, the food on their table, the warmth in James's eyes, and she knew, whatever risk there was, whatever tongues wagged, it was worth holding on to this fragile bond. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara began to feel something new stirring in her heart. Not just gratitude, not just survival. Something gentler, deeper, something she dared not name yet. And in those quiet moments, with Samuel sleeping soundly beside her and the ring still tucked safely in her hand, she allowed herself a thought she hadn't entertained in years. Perhaps kindness could grow into something even stronger. Clara had lived for so long in survival mode that she barely recognized the woman she was becoming. Hunger had defined her days, worry had consumed her nights, and despair had been her constant shadow. But with food in her cupboard, Samuel's belly no longer aching, and James's steady presence weaving quietly into her life, something inside her began to shift. It was not a sudden change, it was gradual, like spring creeping into the land after a bitter winter. At first it was little things. Clara found herself humming as she kneaded dough, her hands no longer trembling from weakness. She began brushing Samuel's hair more carefully in the mornings, even sewing a patch neatly onto his worn shirt. These small acts felt like reclaiming pieces of herself she thought famine had stolen forever. James's visits brought more than supplies. He brought conversation. He asked her about her late husband, about her childhood, about her dreams. Questions no one had bothered to ask her in years. At first, Clara hesitated to answer, afraid of opening wounds that had barely scarred over. But James listened, truly listened, and his silence was never judgmental. It was patient, steady, like the earth beneath her feet. One afternoon, Clara surprised herself. She baked bread, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She carried a small loaf to the widow 2 doors down, who had grown frail in the famine. The woman's tearful thanks left Clara both humbled and proud. For the first time in so long, she was not only receiving kindness, but giving it. The act warmed her more deeply than the bread itself. The town began to notice the change. Clara walked with her head a little higher. Her cheeks, once hollow, now carried a faint blush of color. Samuel, once quiet and withdrawn, laughed and played with other children in the dusty streets. And James, always nearby, always steady, looked at them with a quiet pride that did not need words. But change came with challenges, too. Whispers still followed them. Some townsfolk muttered that Clara was taking advantage of James's generosity. Others accused James of letting his heart blind him to his duty as the rancher's heir. Clara heard those words in passing, felt the sting of judgment, and more than once lay awake at night wondering if she was selfish to accept his help. Yet every time doubt took root, James seemed to sense it. He would appear at her door with a smile and a story that made Samuel laugh, or with a fresh jug of milk, or simply with quiet reassurance. "Let them talk," he said once when her eyes brimmed with worry. "They don't know what it's like to walk in your shoes. They've never had to trade hope for bread." Clara pressed her lips together, her hand tightening around the ring she still kept close. For so long she had measured her worth by what she had lost. The husband buried in the ground, the home reduced to dust, the security stripped away by drought. But James's words and his actions made her realize she was more than what had been taken from her. She was still here. She was still fighting. The greatest change was not visible to others, but Clara felt it growing inside her, the return of dignity. She no longer felt like a beggar at the mercy of strangers. She felt like a woman capable of surviving, of caring for her brother, of standing tall again. And in the quiet hours, when Samuel was asleep and the lamp burned low, Clara allowed herself another thought, tentative, fragile, but real. Maybe she was not destined to walk this road alone forever. The famine did not vanish overnight. The land was still dry, the cattle still lean, and the people still cautious with every bite of food. But for Clara, something far greater than hunger had shifted. For the first time since grief and hardship had hollowed her life, she could see a horizon that wasn't just survival, it was possibility. Samuel was thriving. His cheeks were fuller, his eyes brighter, and his laughter came often, no longer muffled by weariness. He had begun spending afternoons at the ranch, under James's watchful eye, learning how to brush a horse, how to mend a fence, even how to sit tall in a saddle. Each evening he returned bubbling with stories, his excitement infectious. Clara often found herself smiling just listening to him, but it wasn't only Samuel who was changing. Clara herself felt a strength she thought she had buried with her husband. She rose each morning with purpose, not dread. She began helping neighbors more often, sharing what little she had, her spirit rekindled by the kindness she herself had been shown. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a burden, but as a woman capable of giving back. Through it all, James was there. He never demanded recognition, never sought to make himself the hero of her story. Instead, he walked beside her quietly, a steady hand whenever the weight of whispers or hardship threatened to pull her down. The townsfolk who had once gossiped began to soften their tones. They saw Samuel's health returning, Clara's confidence growing, and James's unwavering loyalty. Respect replaced suspicion, though not without some reluctance. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in strokes of crimson and gold, James knocked gently on Clara's door. Samuel had already fallen asleep, worn out from chasing chickens around the ranch yard earlier that day. The house was still, lit only by a single lamp on the table. Clara opened the door, surprised but not unwelcome. "James," she said softly, "is everything all right?" He nodded, though there was a nervousness in his eyes she had never seen before. "I just needed to speak with you." They sat at the table, the silence stretching warm and full between them. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag. He set it on the table, pushing it gently toward her. Clara frowned, hesitant. "What is this?" "Seeds," he said simply. "Corn, beans, squash. Enough to plant a proper garden when the rains return. Enough to give you and Samuel a future that doesn't depend on anyone else's hand." Her throat tightened, emotion rising so swiftly it threatened to spill over. "James, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll plant them. he replied, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed something deeper, hope, and perhaps even fear. Say you'll believe in tomorrow. Clara swallowed hard, her fingers brushing the bag as if it were more precious than gold. I will, she whispered. I promise. James leaned back, relief softening his face. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, after a breath, he added, Clara, it's not just the seeds, it's you. From the first moment I saw you at that wagon, I knew you carried something stronger than gold. I don't know what the future holds, but if you'll let me, I want to walk it with you. Her heart pounded, her hand tightening around the bag of seeds in one hand, the ring in the other. She thought of her late husband, of the life she had lost, and of the fragile, beautiful chance that stood before her now. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled, softly, bravely. You've already given me more than I thought possible, James. Maybe it's time I stop walking alone. Outside, the night was quiet, but inside Clara's heart, something new had begun. Not just survival, not just endurance, but life, rich with hope, with love, and with the promise of a tomorrow where gold mattered little compared to the worth of a human soul. It was, at last, a new beginning.